Good morning, Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page, closer to the middle of page 1430. Explaining our relationship with the divine, with God. That it's one, there is a level where it's a commensurate relationship, meaning that the divine godliness through tzimtzum and concealment has so-called manifest itself into the parameters, first of the Esses, which serve as an interface. The Esses of Atzilus serve as an interface to Beriyah, because Ein Sof itself is beyond structure, beyond definitions. But Beriyah is defined by definitions. And since we say the Eibishter on Hagabahon Alma, what are the 10 spheres? What do? They are the ones that govern existence. This is the way the channels, the instruments, if you wish. You want the arms and legs, the attributes of the divine that manage and govern and supervise over existence. Alma. Excuse me. So they serve as the interface. Mamutza ben Ein Sof le'elam is Beriyah. And in the spheres themselves, Rebbe's sphere is Gufa, the Ikar is Midas Hazah, Midas the Zah Atzilus, which are also called Midas from the word Medida, measure. That's measured and defined Lifi Eifana Elamis. Liya is B'chinas Makar. So this divine energy is now measured and defined according to the parameters of existence, to become a source for that existence. Because Ein Sof itself is Rom Nisnasa Aden Kates B'Tachlis, Sharilav B'Kol Inun Midas Klal, because Ein Sof itself, Ein Sof, defies and transcends, completely, infinitely distant from the 10 spheres, and definitely from Beriyah. So, in order to govern the activities, the actions, of existence is through the midas. And he begins with chesed. He said, the b'chinas chesed of Atzilus, that's the hashpah, that's the channel that transmits lahachis, to sustain, mechalkel chayim b'chesed. And Idrab is called chesed elam. Why? Because it's the chesed, that's the source from which comes the energy to give elam chaya gufa. To sustain the physical life in existence. Mashenke chesed atik, which is higher than Atzilus. So chesed atik, like he said, is called chaya nishmasa. And he compared it, which is completely Eina Makar Klal. It's not a source at all for physical life of Beriyah, Chai Nishmas. And he compared it to the difference between the Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim of Micha, which is Atik removed, and Moshe. So the Micha, the 13 attributes of compassion of Micha is Ba'atik V'hen L'chayin Neshama Shuchaya L'kus V'nira, and the Rebbe Rashab says that also transmits into Beriyah. But it's Chaya L'kus, meaning it's for divine life, for a spiritual life. And Moshe brought down Yud Gimel Sarachim to the level that it should be the source of life for the need of Chaya Gufim. It channels into physical life as well. Like he says in Ider Rabbah, and that's because Chesed of Atzilus was Nitzamtzim. Chesed of Atik remains above existence, even though it transmits into the spirituality of existence. And this Nitzamtzim F'erech HaElamus. This one was diminished to be commensurate, to be proportionate and tailored according to the needs of the world. So it's a different form of energy that's the mamutza of the 10 spheres, and specifically the midas, and specifically here he's speaking about chesed. Now let's continue learning inside. We're going to continue talking about these levels of chesed. Chesed of Atzilus, in contrast to Chesed of Atik, that's higher than Atzilus. With Chesed Atik serving as the interface because it's relates to and more diminished to the point that it can relate to existence. So, middle of the page, the line is Tzamtzam L'Fierecha Elamis. I'm going to read on, and the pages can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. He says like this: V'zehu, and this is the meaning of what we know, the Mekubolim Hadishenim, the earlier Kabbalists, Shekedim Apardes Barizal, that precede the Pardes, the Ramak, Ramesh Karvira, who is a contemporary of the Arizal, both in the 16th century. So the Kabbalim Hadishenim before them, preceding them, they call Midas HaChesed not Chesed. They call it B'Shem Gedulah. Like when we say Gedulah v'Hatiferes, in greatness, Gedulah, God's greatness, God's grandeur. V'Apardes v'Arizal Keidim B'Shem Chesed. And the Pardes v'Arizal call that same level, they call the name Chesed. Ayin Mashnis Bar Le'il B'Zeh. Delve look into what we discussed earlier about this. I don't remember exactly where that is. I do remember it was discussed. I think in volume 2, maybe volume 1 even. Probably can find it if we look around. Okay. So now we'll understand why is that. Why did the early Kabbalists call Chesed with the name Gedulah and the Ramak and the Pardes and the Arizal called with the name Chesed? What's the difference? So he says, Bahainu, and this means the Gedulah Gedulah emphasizes the greatness of God. So it's also Chesed, but the emphasis is on Chesed that comes mitzad Gedulah because of God's great power. Like we learned earlier, the great power to reveal, to illuminate. Shu b'chinas bli gvul. Gedulah refers to greatness, something that's bli gvul, that's infinite. So they were talking about Chesed that's higher than Atzilus. Like we learned before, Chesed of Atik. Doesn't say Atik here, but higher than Atzilus. The Chesed who begins a Chesed Shabbat, and when the Rizal, the Ramak or the Pardes and Rizal use the word Chesed, not Gedulah, they're referring to begins a Chesed Shabbat, they are bitl v'atzimtzum. They're referring to a Chesed that comes down into Atzilus, where they're to bitl and simtzum. Bitl here he means not just nullification as in humility, but he means bitl that is diminished. If it's simtzum and diminished, so it's not chesed as in the full intensity of Gedulah, higher than Atzilus. It's how chesed becomes chesed of Atzilus that now can transmit energy in a more defined way. And he's giving an example, but a human example. Like, for example, when a person transmits chesed due to the fact mitzad shiflus atzmei, he considers himself very lowly. It doesn't mean in a negative way. You feel very like that you don't feel that great in your own eyes. The mishum zeh maniach atzmei. That's why he puts himself aside. She'ein tzarich la'atzmei klum. So instead of filling his own needs and focusing what I need, he doesn't need anything. And he gives whatever he has, ulashpia el kul el azulas. And he focuses on giving to another. In other words, the person is filled with themselves. He doesn't say the word arrogant, but someone who's focusing on their own value and their own needs is not going to do that much chesed. But the chesed that comes when a person feels that I don't feel so important, self-important. So they put themselves aside and they're easy, and they will be then giving. So if they have food or money, it won't be focused just on serving myself, put myself aside and I'm giving to another. In other words, kindness comes from a level of bittul. This is not to suggest that chesed higher than Atzilus is arrogant. It just means there the focus is on how much the giver has to give. Here the focus is on the giver not feeling much of himself. So that bittul causes the chesed. We'll soon see how he explains it in the context of Atzilus. So it's coming from this level of shiflus atzmei, bittul v'tzimtzum. U'kamoy kein hu bedugma lamayla. And so too, the example above, the b'chinas chesed de zoh, the chesed of zoh, of Atzilus, hu b'chinas ha-chesed shemitzad ha-bittul. That's a chesed that comes due to self-nullification, a form of selflessness. Yesh Shleimer, says that Rebbe Rashab, he's going to compare it to what? If you remember, Commission is Beriyah, like we learned 2 pages back on page 1428. He said, if you remember, when he spoke about in Atzilus, there's Aspilus, there's already Midas. So he said, but what does that mean? If you remember, he said it's referring to the Gedulah Elikus, but he said, Gam Yesh Shleimer the Chesed b'chinas habitl v'yichud b'kavon el yena. That when a person attaches themselves and connects to Chesed of Atzilus, is the bitl, we get absorbed in the kavon al yain of Chesed. I'm just reading. Yeah. So he's saying, yes, Shleimer, that we could say, so what is an Aveda, Chesed of Atzilus, is the focus is on losing yourself and being absorbed by something greater. So Gedulah, we'll soon see what he's going to say. I think if he's going to go back to Gedulah or not. But regardless, Chesed of Atzilus is bitl and simtzum, like he says, Hinis a bitl, Yashlema, this level of bitl, of self-nullification and being absorbed in the kavon el yena within it, but simtzum, and the diminishment. That's why that is the pardes, and that is, I'll call it Chesed, in contrast to the earlier Mukabam that called it Gedulah. Because they were focusing, their emphasis was on the greatness of God. It's so great that he expresses himself. Gilui, Chesed, Chesed Bligvul. That Pardes Narizal, which makes sense. Later Mekubalim are talking about how the divine is now coming into a shape and form that relates to us. Like similar to the example when you say, Reif Teva Eini Yechelim Lekabel in Masechta Tainis, that when Cheni Amagel, when they prayed for rain during a famine, so finally the rain began to come, but it came down in buckets. It was flooding the fields. And we know when it floods the fields, it's just as destructive as a drought. So there had to be a second prayer. He had to say a second prayer. We can't accept that. It's too much water, too much tev. Just like a teacher, too much. It has to be drop by drop so we can absorb it. So that means the chesed has to go through a tzimtzum for it to be proper. Like gvura sheba chesed. That's why it's called gvura kshamim. Even though rain is chesed, it's hashpah, it's a transmission, it's a gili. But it's a gili that's measured according to the recipient that we can absorb it. Drop by drop is absorbed in the ground, and that makes things grow. It comes down unlimited, which would be like chesed of Gedulah. But they were talking about God's power. And the Ramak, the Pardes Narizal, are talking about how chesed is commensurate to existence. And he calls it, and that's the bitl and simtsum. Interesting, the example he gives, he's given a Vedic example. That Naveda, that means like putting yourself aside, not focusing on how much you have to give, but focusing on putting yourself aside. I'm not a factor here, and the main focus is on giving to another. Needs probably more understanding why he gives this example, but it's definitely an Vedic example, and that's the meaning. That's why maybe the parentheses comes to explain that. Because he's talking about Chesed of Atzilus, where it's not Chesed of Beriyah. Chesed of Beriyah is already in creation. This is a level where it's still divine. So we put ourselves aside and we channel the divine, but in a Chesed that's defined. Yeah. Omnam, b'chinas Chesed the Atik. However, Chesed of Atik, like we learned, that doesn't have any relationship with physical life, with the life of the body, so to speak. But he means here bodies, as I explained, the physicality, the defined, Beriyah. It's a higher level, and that's why it's called Gedulah. That level is like it says, Ata Kodesh v'Shimcha Kodesh. You are holy and sacred and removed, and your name is Kodesh, sacred and removed. The Ime Yeshish name Kodesh, even though we say Ata and Shimcha, both of them we say Ata Kodesh, Shimcha Kodesh, Nevertheless, there's a difference between them. That's why we don't say Ata v'Shimcha Kodesh. We say Ata Kodesh v'Shimcha Kodesh. You are Kodesh, you are holy, sacred, and removed. Havdalah, Kodesh from the word removed, higher than. And Shimcha Kodesh. So both are Kodesh, but there's a difference. What's the difference? The Ata Kodesh means you are holy, who shafilu b'china ziv v'hoid lo yoya el misichem lekabel memenu. That means that even the level of ziv v'hoid, your reflection, that shafilu b'china ziv v'hoid, Ata Kodesh, that even the level of Ata, ziv v'hoid, your reflection and your hoid is your covet, your beauty, your glory. The worlds cannot receive from there because it's higher than existence. Shimcha is already referring to a level where your reflection can be received by the recipients. Like we say, hoidu al eretz v'shamayim. So now we're talking about on earth and heaven, the level of Heid v'ziv. So there's a reflection of the divine that's higher than existence, and there's a reflection of the divine that manifests and relates to existence. The Shemayim, to Eretz v'Shamayim. Val derech zeh, and similar to this, Ubchinas Chesed Atik v'Chesed Dezah. He's comparing Chesed Atik is more like Ata Kodesh, Ata, and Chesed Dezah is more like Shimcha Kodesh, Shimcha. Between Chai and Neshama is Chai the Gufim. The difference between Gedulah and Chesed. V'hainu.
So this is higher than Gimel Midas Rachamim. According to Moshe, Gimel Midas Rachamim is Chai Gufim. And Chesed Atik, he said, has nothing to do with Chai Gufim.
Right. Correct.
So that means that its Chesed Atik is higher than Yud Gimel Midas Rachamim.
No, who says maybe Chesed the Atik is the level of Yud Gimel Midas Rachamim of Micha?
Of Micha, not at Moshe.
Yeah, we're talking about exactly. Correct. Yeah. He said Moshe Himshech Hayud Gimel Midas Rachamim b'Zah. So that's in Zah. Micha is in Atik. Yeah. V'hainu. This means the Fisha Chesed the Zah, there's Chesed of Zah in Atzilus, who beginners Keli Mamish. That's an Keli. That's already defined as a structure, an energy, and a container. So the energy is Chesed, but it's in a container. It has parameters. It's a definition. It has borders, so to speak. That the air has diminished and been concealed to be channeled, commensurate to and proportionate to the container. So you're talking about, like I said before, if it's an outpouring of chesed that's not defined, is not limited to the containers, it'll flood, it'll overflow. But here in chesed dezah, the chesed gets channeled into the container. And the container is already the source of biyah, like we learned earlier, if you remember, Yudei Yudua. So Yudeya is already the kelim of Atzilus. So the kelim is the source of biyah. The eidus of Atzilus, which reflect the divine chesed, is manifesting in it. So you see, it's coming closer and serving as an interface. Whereas chesed of Atik does not yet have eidus kelim and quite in that level. Ubchinas Chochma dezah, who makar chesed dezah. So to complete the picture, he's saying, Zah, remember, Midas also have all the spheres in them. Just like there are 10 spheres, the 10 have 10 within them. So what's Chochma of Zah? Who makar chesed dezah? That's the source of where chesed dezah draws from. Pirush, shu ha-chochma eich she'iyah chesed lashpiyah ha'chayim. So there's two parts when you're mashpiyah chesed or chayim, life, mechalkel chayim b'chesed. There's the actual transmission, that's chesed, but the wisdom guides it and essentially determines. Eich sheyeh. How's that chesed should flow? That's why we say that you need Chochma first, because Chochma plans and allocates and determines. Chesed channel is the actual implementer. And here I see, going back to yesterday, the question was asked, what about the Kav HaMidah, which in Beriyah says is also the level of the tikla, the wheel. So he's now going to bring that into the picture. Okay. Now remember, we're talking all about chesed. He's soon going to talk about gvura. Remember, because we're talking about the midas of Atzilus, our interface between the divine and existence. Here we're talking about how chesed is mashpia chayis, chayi guf, physical life, commensurate and lefiyerech. If a soul or divine energy would not have these parameters, it would be too powerful to enter into a body, basically. So the neshama has to go through many tzimtzumim to be able to enter into a body and not blow the circuits, so to speak, like too much electricity. So the air and the keli have to work with each other. And that's what happens in Atzilus. That sets the stage to be an interface to create chesed of biyah, and all the way down to the lower worlds, Yitzira and Asiyah. But now he added also the Chochma part, the Chochma within Zah. It's also part of the interface. I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything, then I'll read the parentheses. So the parentheses, V'yesh leimer, this is a parenthesis that goes almost to the bottom of the page. It's 7 lines. So he says like this, V'yesh leimer, we can say, Shezeu k'may shekosav b'Beriyah vayishlach. This is a famous Beriyah, cited often in Chassidus. Beriyah, as I said, Beriyah is usually the Mittler Rebbe's Hanochis, where he wrote down transcripts of the Alter Rebbe, who would explain Zohar every week for a number of years, every Shabbos, Friday night usually. And then the Tzemach Tzedek has a Beriyah where he often takes the Beriyah of the Mittler Rebbe, Alter Rebbe, and explains it further. This whole piece that we're learning, if you remember, began with a Beriyah from the Tzemach Tzedek, based on the Maimer. It's an Alter Rebbe, Tov Kuf Samach Hey. Yeah. Okay. So he says that Yesh Leimer, that this is like it says in Beriyah Vayishlach. Al Maimer HaZoyer Al Posuk Ki Yesharim Darkei Hashem. So the Posuk says Ki Yesharim, the ways of God, Yesharim are straight paths. So he explains what means paths. What's Derech Hashem mean? They say the paths of God. So a path is a channel. And that's how he explains it. What does he say? Be'inyan hakav v'chut. The kav v'chut is the words of the Arizal in Eitz Chaim after the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum conceal the divine infinite energy. Now you have a black hole. You have the Tzimtzum chol l'mokim panei, an empty space, a hole. There's a reshimu, a trace, but it's not revealed. Then he says, "V'achekach himshich hav v'chut kotzer." A kav means a line, a chut means a thread. So it's a thin line of energy. You could think of it like a laser beam, a flow of energy, but now it's thin. It's not bligvul in the sense all expansive, because that's the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Like the Igla God, the Kav carries the flow like the stylus, like the paintbrush, that will carry this energy and create existence. So he explains, but where does it come from? The Kav is not an independent entity. It originates from the Ein Sof. It's like the teacher who completely fell silent in order to conceal the brilliance, his infinite brilliance, but then begins a flow. He begins to speak. His flow is the kav. It's coming from that brilliance. It's coming from the oil, but now it's coming in a very narrow flow, in a very defined flow that will be tailored to be able to shape a structured existence of an independent consciousness that shouldn't be overwhelmed by the Eir Lifnei HaTzimtzum. Similar to what we said about Chesed of Atik. It's too much. doesn't have eris and kelim. So he's saying that in Beriyah Azer, the in akav v'chut hanimshech me'ein sof. So he explains there in the Beriyah Azer with an example. Shu al derech moshel, that this kav, the chut, this thin line, this line, stream, you can say, of energy, is al derech moshel, like an example, sinner, and mekaleach mayim menor godel, like a sinner, like a channel, like when you irrigate fields. So you could take menor godel from a big river, an expansive river, but you have to now channel into the fields, or else it'll flood the fields. So sinner mekaleach mayim, it so-called gathers and consolidates and channels the water from a nar gadol, from a big river, and it fills up the kelim. Kelim could be either smaller branches or actual containers. Just like when you're pouring from a very big barrel, you need a funnel. You need some channel that's going to take the large amount, the volume, and channel it into kelim. So he gives an example of that, of a sinner that takes from a nar gadol, which is a big river of water, a reservoir of water, and it fills the containers. Actually, he's not saying here necessarily irrigating fields. Let me correct that. He's talking about bringing a lot of water to bring it. So first it's channeled and it fills up the containers that stand around that are outside of the river. So you have one big sinner, one channel that channels the water, and then it slowly branches off into tzinedes ktanim and fill up the containers. So that's the way you can bring from someone from a large mass, you can channel it into specific detailed place, which is exactly what we've been talking about. So he says, Yesh Lemer, that's the level, how the chesed in Zah is mashpia. V'yesh b'zeh chochma muka. And there's chesed within Zah. It's not just hashpah. There's a profound wisdom in this process. Because, for example, you see people who are brilliant teachers, but they don't know how to communicate well. They say either too much or too little. So it's a chochma of its own in the chochma muka of how to communicate. How do you effectively convey an idea that doesn't overwhelm your students, but also doesn't underwhelm them? Something that's perfectly balanced, that is providing enough, but also in a way that they can integrate it. So that's a chochma muka. That according to that wisdom, Ayin Beis, he will, I would say Ayin means to delve into, but he will look deeply into, he'll analyze. Well, Yifakeach, Ayin means to delve into, Yifakeach means to dissect, or Yifakeach, to determine.
Maybe the Yifkach will open.
Yeah, but it's also from the word from pikhus. It's also from the word pikhus here, like a certain and not intuition, a certain sharp, a certain perception. How, what manner that should be the channeling of that, the flow of that channel, in general, and for sure, how to break it down further to each one individually. Think of a good teacher in a classroom. She has many students. So there's a wisdom that's necessary. How do you communicate the idea to the students in general? But then the students are different levels. So how do you communicate to make sure that each student, according to his needs, students that are smarter will get it quicker. And that's why many of them get bored if you speak only to the lower common denominator in the class. So it requires a pichus, it requires a iyun and a wisdom, a chochma muka, to determine how the flow should in general go to your class, and also in a way that different individuals will get what they need. Exactly like in the example, the tziner klali, the channel from the river, to channel the flow, and then break it further down, branch it off into each particular keli according to its needs. So you'll see that requires a tremendous wisdom. That's beyond the wisdom of the knowledge itself that you're communicating. It's how to communicate. a methodology of how to communicate effectively, especially when you're dealing with different individuals. So that's the example. What about the kav? So what's the nimshal, the moral? He says, "U'kamoy kein hakav." So too is the kav. Hu b'chinas sinner hatzinner hagadol. The kav is the large artery. Think of it like the artery, the main artery. And that's a good word, artery, sinner, channel, which before it breaks down and branches down into smaller arteries. So the kav is the sinner hagadol, hanimshek mahanor hagadol, that extends from the large river, Kinis Erein Sof. So the Nor Gadol, the river in the Moshul, is what is the Erein Sof before the Tzimtzum, before the Kav. The Kav is the first channel, the wide channel, the first artery and channel that draws it. Umemenonim Shochim. And from that one channel, one artery, from that extends Sineris Ktanim, narrower like veins that branch off from the main artery. And that's all coming from so the kav is carrying all the energy, and then it breaks down, is into tzenedet dam. That means Yesharim Darkei Hashem, plural. What are the Darkei Hashem? The ways of God are these channels. That's what he explains in Beriyah Azer. But Eifan Amshachas HaTzenedes. So Chesed would be the actual flow, but the manner of how these tzenedes, these channels transmit, while Pia Chochma de Teira is according to the wisdom of Teira, Sheti Amshacha b'madrega zu, that the Amshacha should come into this level, u'ba'elam zeh should come down to each specific respective level, and in that world, ba'efan kach v'kach, in one world in a certain manner, u'bezeh ba'efan kach, and another world based on its parameters, ba'efan kach in another manner. So it's not just a flow, it's a flow that is using tremendous wisdom to know how to tailor it and how to channel it each to each world, to each level and each entity according to its needs, according to its parameters. That's the parentheses. So he explained here both the idea of the way Chesed with the flow works, but also the Chochma within Zoh. The Chochma, the wisdom that's required. And that's Chochma within Zoh required to determine how that process should happen. That's Chesed of Zoh. How about Gvura? Remember, it's not just one midah. We have 6 midas of Zoh. The Gvura hu letzamtzem achayis. Gvura is the manner in which you diminish the chayis. Chesed is the flow, and knowing how to make sure the flow is proper. And Gvura is the tzimtzum of the chayis. Like we learned earlier, the concealment. So now you have Chesed and Gvura. With the Gvura, he just says a few words, doesn't elaborate. The big elaboration here was Chesed of Zoh. How about the role of Bina? Well, let me stop here before I continue. Any questions?
It's like the heart, almost. Like you say, the Chesed, the aorta, the main artery you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, and then the veins maybe are the Gevura. I don't know.
No, the veins are not the Gevura. The veins are the Tzenedes Ktanim, are the branches from the main artery.
Okay. So what would be
is the effort of the process of concealment, of the discipline, that very process that the teacher, that in this case a teacher would use to withhold or restrain.
I understand.
So there's two sides. There's a wisdom of how the flow should manage, but there is also Gevura that restrains and limits. So it's two different things. There's the flow and there's the flow, and I would say the restraint or the refrain. Okay. They work together, obviously. For the flow to be measured, that part of it is that Gevura. But first he explained it in terms of Chesed, then he brings Gevura is the Tzimtzum Achayis. And they work hand in hand. Then he brings also, since he spoke about Chochma, I guess he's also saying now one more line in this paragraph. Bina, what is Bina in Atzilus? Hu haseichel lebchinas Gevura. Aha, because Chochma and Chesed are both in the right line. Gevura and Bina are Gevura, are both in the left, smile. When the spheres are structured like three pillars. So it's Chochma, Chesed, Netzach, Bina, Gvura, Hoid. So he says, Bina hu aseichel lebchinas Gvura zu, Echu kama roi elias atzimtzum. How much and how, how and kama and how much, like quality and quantity, is necessary for the tzimtzum. The rachamim ukava amsoi, and rachamim is the middle path. He doesn't elaborate on this. I'll just elaborate a bit to give a little more explanation. Even though you could argue, 1 second, doesn't Chesed also need Bina? Chochma is the wisdom and the so-called the wisdom necessary, the deep wisdom necessary to know how to make sure the Chesed flows properly. Bina elaborates on that. But here it seems like he wants to focus on the fact that Chesed and Chochma have a unique relationship, and Bina and Gvura have a unique relationship. I'm not sure why. I'd have to look it up in other Maimorim, but he's clearly saying that it's the Bina requires a certain level of understanding, not Chochma alone, but Bina to know how to be mitzamtzim. Why is that dependent more on Bina, and why is Chesed more on Chochma? I need to look into that. I mean, I have my theories on it. Like you say, Bina Yasera Nitna Be'isha. A woman has more Bina. Because Bina is not just a strategy or a deep wisdom, it's a certain intuition of knowing how to limit the flow. Whereas Chochma seems to be how to manage the flow or how to flow properly. So I have to look up why he's saying it that way. And Rachamim, he just says briefly, is the middle midah, kavam tzai. You could go back to page 1428, where there he said Chesed was Gilui, Gvura was Helam, and Tiferes was the combination of Gvura and Helam, that they both interact and interdependent on each other. That was on page 1428. I'm just thinking, can that be applied here? I think so.
It looks like.
Yeah, but the problem is this, not the problem, I'm sorry. The challenge we have to understand here, it's really not so relevant to Ayin Beis, but since he's already touching upon it, let me just point out a question that you may have. What's the difference? Why do you need Tiferes? If you have the proper wisdom that tells you how to channel Chesed, you have the proper Gvura and Bina and Gvura that also tells you how to restrain. What does Tiferes add? So briefly, based on page 1428, the answer would be, it adds how they interact with each other. Because sometimes there can be a conflict. There's some people, for example, you see in businesses, they're the people who decide what bonus to give their employees. And then there's always the controller, the Baal Gvura, who comes and says, maybe we should limit the bonus. So there's always that giver, and there's the one has more discretion. So there could be a conflict between the two. But when you understand Tiferes, and Tiferes comes and teaches that the purpose of Gilui is in order to go through the Tzimtzum, and the purpose of Tzimtzum is in order to bring Gilui. So then you have a perfect blend between the two. In other words, Chesed and Gvura themselves have a wisdom of giving and restraint and discipline. But Tiferes really creates a real harmony between the two, where it's like a seamless harmony where the giving is so beautiful. Like I've mentioned many times, you see a gifted writer or a gifted communicator, you don't even realize that they're both doing Tzimtzum and Gilui all at once, because it's so perfectly matched. When you see someone who's not such a good communicator, you'll see they're using too many words, or they're using too few words. Either the Gilui is too much, or the Helam is too much. And the perfect poetic balance is where you see it just flows smoothly. You read, it's so seamless, you can't even tell that you're reading words. But the fact is, you are reading words. But the writer is so brilliant in their ability to communicate that the Oid and the Keli are perfectly matched. And that's what Tiferes does. It creates the harmony, the beauty. It's that balance. Whereas Chesed itself is the power to reveal. And yes, revealing in a way that's measured. Gvura is the measurer, the so-called restrainer, the concealer. And Tiferes is Kavam Tzoy, that mechaber that connects the two. So I did end up explaining it, actually. Okay. So all this in Atzilus essentially are the instruments. You could say the resource room, like I said, where God lays out these attributes that will become the interface to allow for the creation of the parameters of Midas and Beriyah, Yitzir, Asiyah, ultimately manifesting within ourselves, in our faculties. And that's the interface. Chesed, and higher than Atzilus, is beyond us. It's more reflection of the divine, infinite, Ein Sof, Bli Gvul, like we learned till now. Chaya Neshama, Chaya HaNeshamas, more spiritual, more ethereal. Here it's Chaya Gufim, it's channeling energy into the parameters that will ultimately also include the parameters of a physical life. And so that explains Atzilus as an interface. He hasn't gone back yet to Malchus. Remember, all this began in understanding Tikla. Malchus is the place where the Shinui happens, where our Ma'aseh Tachtonim, our actions interact and actually have an effect. Chesed of Atzilus, Zoh, is the place of the potter. Like he said, Kutsha Brichu, who turns the wheel of Malchus, is manifest in Zoh. So we've understood now that Atzilus is the interface, and specifically Zoh of Atzilus, governed by Chochma and Bina and so on, like we learned. That ends this paragraph. Any questions? So
a quick question.
There's more to come. There's more to come because he has to still bring it back to Malchus, which he will do. We're not moving on to another subject. He's going to tie it all together. So just be patient. You'll see he's soon going to bring it all together. He wants to give it like classic style Atzilus, especially the Rebbe Rashab, giving the whole elaborate picture. So it takes a little more time, but when you finish, you get the whole big picture. Makes it far more richer and more broader and more contextual. Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you for the explanation. I in terms of how Rachamim, how Tiferes is, sort of a balance between Chesed and Gvura, and some sort of perfect flow, if you will. And it's sufficient on its own, the way you explained it, also the prior page, 1428. But that being said, I'm just curious because he talked about Kava, Yamin Kava, small, and they have in the middle Kav, Tiferes, which is, I think, aligned with Das. Can you say that Das is essentially that which it combines Chochma and Bina in a way that personalizes, but makes it balanced, so it can be contained within one Gilui, within one revelation, so that he doesn't say. I guess the question is, he doesn't say it, but could it be implied that Tiferes is aligned with Kava Hamsai and Das?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
It goes like this: Chachan Baga Dati. Dati is the Kava.
Das,
Tiferes,
Yesod. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Malchus, for that matter.
Yeah. And Malchus, thank you.
Yeah, look, the Rebbe Rashab is saying enough to get his point across.
Right.
He's not coming here so much as a full analysis of Atzilus.
To
He
put a
gave an
legal
example
proof,
of Chesed primarily, mentions Gvura, mentions Tiferes, and he relies that we'll either know from other places and develop it and flesh it out. But the key point is the interface, because he wants to still bring it back. Remember, let's not forget the larger theme is the interaction and interface between divine and existence in a way that works on both our terms and God's terms. That's the real key thing to remember here. I will also say in some places it actually says that the Kav is rooted in Tiferes Hanelam. Sometimes it says Malchus of Ein Sof. So the Kav also has elements of Tiferes, being that sinner. Even though he does speak here that sinner is Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes, but Tiferes, sometimes the Kav is associated with Tiferes.
Awesome. Where can I find that? More elaboration about that?
I would go to Sefer Lekutim, either Erech Tiferes or Kav.
Okay, thank you.
And there's plenty on that topic. Okay. There's two opinions, Tiferes Hanel and Malchus, whether it's Primis HaKav, Chetzenius HaKav. Actually, in volume 1, he also spoke about it briefly.
Okay, thank you.
It's Tzinetus. So I'll continue the next page. Let's start. Page 1431, next paragraph. Omnom. However, Kol Zeh Sheba Atzilus Gufa. One second. Let me just see. So now he's going to qualify. What we just learned, that seems like Atzilus is so defined. Mida from the word medida, measure. Whereas Atik is Ein Sof and Bligvul, like we learned. So he says, however, he's going to explain that's only within Atzilus. But compared to Biyah, Atzilus is Elikus, is Ein Sof, like we learned earlier. And that's why we're going to need Malchus. But based on this, you stop here. You say, hey, okay, we have Atzilus. We have the interface. Let's move right into Biyah. Not so fast. Because remember, we want to retain the divinity and God's terms as well. We don't want to suddenly lose sight and compromise the integrity of the divine force within it all. It's true, we have now come into a world of Eris and Kalim, in contrast to Atik. So he says, Omnam kol zeh sho b'Atzilus gufa b'chinas zah hu shenimded liyes b'chinas malka lebiyah. In Atzilus itself, zah is measured in order to become a source, like he says below, which missing the word malka lebiyah. That we understand. That chesed of Atzilus, or zah of Atzilus, is now measured to be the channeler, to be able to carry the energy, the divine, into Biyah. The parentheses comes to emphasize another point in this. I'd rather skip the parentheses, but I'll read it. I don't want to confuse the matters. But he's going to be coming to say that compared to Biyah, the esospheres of Atzilus are still in a level of Ein Sof. But let's read the parentheses. And delve into and look what it says elsewhere. Interesting, he says, but Mokamacha, this was explained at length earlier in Ayin Beis, chapter 145. You go to volume 1, page, I have written down, 281 and on, he discussed this Mokamacha. So sometimes the Rebbe Rashab says Mokamacha, sometimes Kamoshin is Bar Le'il. I can't tell you exactly why, which sometimes he doesn't say that it was mentioned earlier. I'm sure the Rebbe, if I knew that's mentioned earlier, the Rebbe Rashab for sure knows. So I can't tell you why. But it says, I'm Ashkos Mokamacher, the Bishtalshus Ha'esespheres Ba'Atzilus, that in the evolution or the process of the 10 spheres of Atzilus, as they flow forward, Yesh Beis Madregas. There's 2 levels in that Ishtalshus. Mashal Tzedech Atzilus Atzmei. So the Esespheres are what's in within them. They bear the power that's necessary for having the 10 spheres of Atzilus itself, but they also have something else within them. They also have the power, the Ishtalshus, that's going to be needed for when it enters into Biyah. So it's almost like a teacher, the master teacher is teaching an idea to his special student. So there are things that he's teaching him that's exclusively for his student. But he's also teaching him enough material that he'll be able to use to teach to his students. So Atzilus really carries, so to speak, 2 dimensions. What it needs for its own spheres and what it will need to be able to create and transmit to Biyah, to the next level, which just intensifies the concept of the interface. So everything is here very measured. So in Atzilus itself, you have the Biyah within Atzilus, if you wish, because you have already that which is necessary for Biyah. It's not yet in Biyah, but it's in Atzilus itself. It's what is necessary for Biyah. So this is all within Atzilus itself. Ach legabe Biyah, but relatively speaking, compared to Biyah, the B'chinas Esses spheres of Atzilus, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, hein b'chinas Ein Sof adayin. They're still, relatively speaking, Ein Sof. When Biyah looks at Chesed of Atzilus, it sees an infinite flow. And this is not just the oyer of Atzilus, the energy. B'hainu, this means Shagam HaKelim d'Atzilus hein b'chinas Ein Sof. Even the definitions and the parameters of Atzilus are in a state of Ein Sof. Like it says in Sefer Yetzirah, attributed to Avram Avinu, maybe the first Kabbalistic work ever. Esses spheres bli ma, 10 spheres without substance. Bli ma means without substance. It's 10 spheres, but bli ma. Midosan eser she'ein lehem sof. Their number is 10, but they have no end. The Hainu, which means the Gam Kamoshem Bechinas Midah V'Gvul, even as they manifest in measure and parameter and definition, which is through the Kalim, Hemakol Mokim Bechinas Ein Sof. So even as they manifest Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, their flow is Ein Sof. As it says elsewhere, and one of the explanations given for it is Chesed is not Gvura. That's what makes it separate. That's why there's a parameter. But the Chesed itself is Ein Sof Lishpashtuse. If you go to Atzilus and say, how much Chesed do you have to give? Endless. It's Chesed, so there's a structure. It's not Gvura. Same thing with Gvura. How much Gvura? Endless. In Beriyah, it's not just measured by entities that are separate, but even the flow is limited. Chesed only goes that far. Gvura only that far. Similar to what we learned about Etzem Koyach Hariyah. The eye, the power of vision in your soul, has endless ability to see anywhere. Doesn't have any limits. But the way the vision comes into the eye, it has limits. So in Atzilus, it's defined in contrast in Atik or higher than Atzilus. Even the spheres themselves are not defined yet, like we learned. And that's why it's Bli Gvul. You don't call it Chesed versus Gvura. They're all more divine entities, divine power, if you wish. In Atzilus, they come, at least you have now structure. But it's still, compared to Beriyah, it's a Bli Gvul Ein Sof state, like he explains elsewhere. Val Kain. And that's why Mebchinas Chesed, Atzilus, Shu Bchinas Ein Sof, and that's why it's not enough just to have Atzilus, the 10 spheres, with that Chesed itself, that level of Ein Sof, Beriyah, Shu Bchinas Gvul. From that alone, it's not enough. We need some intervention, because that alone is not enough to create Chesed Beriyah, which is Gvul. Because how do you get from the Bli Gvul Chesed of Atzilus to the Gvul of Beriyah or Beriyah? Like we learned earlier, that the camp of Mechal, Ba'ava, which serves with love, Shein Nivroim Bali Gvul. They are limited and defined, finite creatures. And so too the container of Chesed in the world of Beriyah, Va'eris the Ruach v'Nefesh, Heim B'chinas Nivra Bali Gvul, and the Eris of Ruach and Nefesh of Beriyah, not Neshama, because Neshama relates more to Atzilus, are also Nivra Bali Gvul, our creation of a finite creation, like he says in the Gedulah Kedesh 20, Epistle 20, and it's completely, infinitely apart from Chesed of Atzilus. Okay, 1 second. I just want to see. I'm trying to end somewhere. I see it just keeps on going. Okay. Bottom line is, I'm going to stop here. Bottom line is that they're infinitely apart. So now we need another element that's going to serve as an interface between Atzilus and Beriyah. So Atzilus played a tremendous role because it's the interface between Ein Sof and Beriyah. It's got it down into at least a structure of defined attributes. But we still have to get the Bli Gvul into a more Gvul state. And that's the next level. Now, if you think about it, I always give the example of a developing fetus. Anything that develops from metamorphosizes from one state to another, you're going to see these type of stages. First, you have to get it into one state. Then you get it into another state. I mean, it's really the essential of all chemical reactions, and so much technology is based on this as well. The process of taking something that is completely in a state that is without limits and parameters and channeling into some type of structure. So it's not just a one-step process. That's what he's essentially spelling out here. And he's going to ultimately come to Malchus. That Malchus plays a key role here. That's where this is leading to. But I'm going to stop here. I think it's a good place to stop. But so we're middle of this discussion of the contrast between the Ein Sof of Atzilus Chesed and the Chesed of Beriyah, which is Gvul. And therefore, you can't just have Atzilus alone. You need another interface here to work its way in between the two. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Any questions? Okay.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Back when the rabbi was teaching us about Kodesh, was the rabbi, I think, saying that Kodesh means separate, and that means Atik and above, the level of Atik and above?
First of all, not Kodesh, Kodesh. Ata Kodesh, Kodesh.
Kodesh.
Kodesh is a different word than Kodesh. It's a different level. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so okay. So what level would that correspond to? Is it Atik and above?
What it sounded like he said was Ata Kodesh corresponds more to Atik, even though he didn't say it explicitly, and Shimcha to Zah. He said it clearly. He said Chesed Atik and Chesed Zah.
So, but can we have Kodesh in this world that we live in, like Kodesh Kadoshim and?
Well, we say in this week's Parsha, Kadoshim Tiyu, you should sanctify yourself because God is sacred.
Yeah.
Every mitzvah, we say, Asher Kedoshanu b'mitzvayso v'tzivanu. Every mitzvah you do is a form of sanctifying yourself and the object that you do the mitzvah with. But here he's talking about God being Kodesh. God is Ata Kodesh Shimcha, 2 levels in the divine. But of course, we draw from God's Kedusha into this world through our mitzvahs, through our actions, through our good deeds. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi.
In that Kedusha itself, there's a level that relates to us and there's a level that's beyond. Yeah. Okay. So, any other questions? So we'll stop here. Basically, around 9 lines, 10 lines. 9 lines at the top of page 1431. And we'll continue. I have to point out that maybe tomorrow I may not be giving a class. I'll post it on the group. So please share it because I may have something that's a conflict that I will not be able to give the class. But Sunday and Monday also I will be out of town, going to Arizona for I'm speaking there in Arizona Sunday, giving 2 talks, Kabbalah of parenting and the Kabbalah of relationships, I believe, in near Phoenix.
Is that the place where you do the Soul Conference?
Same city, but it's a different entity. This is much more for a more secular, universal crowd.
Are these presentations going to be recorded and broadcast?
I hope so. I think so.
Wonderful.
I'm looking right now. It's on our webpage, on our homepage. Live Sunday, yeah.
Wonderful.
So Sunday, I'm traveling early, yeah, Sunday. Yeah. Kabbalah of parenting, and the second will be
Rabbi, you should have a safe trip.
okay, thank you.
We're still recording because I had a question, but I didn't want
How
to
to
be
use
recorded on
Kabbalah
it.
to recognize your unique calling in life. Yeah. It's on the web.
Wonderful.
Okay. I didn't stop the recording yet. I'll stop it now. Top of page 1431.